Okay, I'm going to preface this with I am not trying to get you in hot water here, but you mentioned Andrew Jackson, and he today I think probably has the worst reputation of any president, at least in popular culture, and maybe even considering Donald Trump as well. But what were the most important characteristics of his presidency? And maybe I should be more specific and say, what were his accomplishments as you view them, or the historians view them?
And this is a really great example, Robinson, of how the views of the experts change because of new evidence, but also because when we're in a new moment, we see these issues differently, right? So for many Americans after World War II, Andrew Jackson was the model for Franklin Roosevelt. Andrew Jackson was seen as the great heroic president. Why? Because of a couple of accomplishments. One thing, he brought new people into the electorate. Before Andrew Jackson, before 1828, the American electorate is largely people with white powdered wigs. It's the image we have from the paintings of the time, right? It's a very small electorate. It's a very elite electorate. Every president before Jackson is either from Massachusetts or Virginia. He's from Tennessee, originally actually from the Carolinas. He brings into the American political system all these mostly white working class people on farms, in cities. He is the great hope for them. He is the first populist, and he makes our politics connect outside of elite circles. What does he do in that context? He actually does a lot for them. He tries to, first of all, in eliminating the national bank, he tries to make money more available. He tries to basically create inflation so working class people will get more money and will have more money that they can use for more things. He encourages westward settlement, and that is a huge problem. It's what he's most condemned for, in forcing Indians off the land, which he does, and he should be condemned for. But from the perspective of settlers, he's a great hero. He helps them get access to land. For those like himself, right, who are coming from the Carolinas and elsewhere and hungry for land, for farms, he provides a basis. They see him as the second Jefferson in that sense. So in many ways, Jackson is the first populist president. And those who believe our politics should be less elitist, more populist, see him. You could make the argument that Jackson and William Jennings Bryan and Theodore Roosevelt are some of the great presidents who bring new people out to vote and bring them into the electorate.
I'm sorry for my lack of historical knowledge, but how explicitly did he bring people into the electorate? Is it just by getting laws passed that allow more people to vote, or just by creating inflation and once you have a certain wealth threshold, or what was going on?
Some of that. The most important thing he did was actually what the founding fathers would have been against. He created a really vibrant mass party called the Democratic Party. The modern Democratic Party begins with Andrew Jackson. You can date it back to Thomas Jefferson, but it's really Andrew Jackson. He created a mass party, and that mass party went out there and encouraged people to vote who wouldn't have voted otherwise. This is when you could begin to get the stories of you're an immigrant worker in Boston, and come election day, someone comes to your workplace, they take you to a bar, they get you drunk, and then they take you to vote. Oh, and by the way, they give you the ballot, which is already filled out. But he's getting those kinds of individuals into the electorate. They become part of the system, as they had not been before. And he very legitimately tries to serve their interests. This is not just a game for him. He believes they've been underserved. This is why he favors westward settlement. These are often people who are striving, working hard as craftsmen in agricultural positions of various kinds, and they don't have access to land. He wants to get them access to land. He wants to get them access to resources they wouldn't have access to otherwise. And he's seen as a great hero in that sense.
Okay. So, no, that totally answers my question. So the law wasn't changed. It was just sort of the engineering of social pressure to vote. And in the book, you describe Andrew Jackson as the first Democrat. And this was something I didn't totally understand, since America's always been a democracy. But now I imagine that you call him that, well, one, not only because he brought more people into the electorate than ever before, but because he was the head of the Democratic Party.
That's exactly right. And he really, of course, we have to say he supported slavery. He didn't think women should vote. So there are limits to this. But for his time, he believed that uneducated immigrant workers and poor white agricultural workers, that they should have the right to vote and the right to own land. And that was a radical thing for that time. It was a radical thing in the world. Most people in Europe didn't think that.
Well, this raises another meta-historical question like the ones with which we started. But you said he encouraged Western settlement, which on the one hand was terrible for the Native American population, but on the other hand, terrific for settlers. And I'm wondering how, as an historian, or how historians in general judge the accomplishments of a president from the past who lived in a different culture with different prevailing morals, and how you judge accomplishments relative to your own morals, how that gets in the way of things or affects things.
This is a very knotty question, and I don't think historians have a very clear and easy answer because we're constantly struggling with this. We struggle with this with Andrew Jackson. We struggle with this when we write about slavery, when we write about Thomas Jefferson, right? Who not only owned slaves, but raped, right? At least one of his slaves, right? But yet he argues for freedom and individual liberty. So I think there are two things we have to recognize. First of all, it's our job to tell the story. And we can't avoid taking a moral position. That's not possible. But we have to tell the story as accurately as we can. And so we have to tell the story of Andrew Jackson, what he was trying to do, those who benefited and those who did not benefit, those who were harmed, the genocidal consequences for Native peoples. And we have to tell that story, first of all. We can't just tell one side. So I'm very uncomfortable with someone who says all we need to know about Andrew Jackson is that he helped white settlers, or someone who says all we need to know about him is that he killed Indians. I'm uncomfortable with someone who says all you need to know about Thomas Jefferson is he wrote the Declaration of Independence, or the opposite, he was a slave owner. We have to tell a fuller story. We have to see the complexity. And then we have to judge people based upon not what we think today, but based upon their own time. And here is where we are, I think, appropriate to condemn someone like Andrew Jackson. Because in his time, Andrew Jackson's treatment of Indians was condemned by many people, particularly by people in the Whig Party, and particularly by those who knew Native communities quite well. And in fact, he was sued, and the Supreme Court ruled that he was going beyond legitimate presidential power, and he ignored the Supreme Court, actually. So in his own time, he went beyond what were considered the acceptable moral. And so I think it is fair to condemn him in those ways. It is fair also with Thomas Jefferson because he himself recognized that slavery was immoral. If you read Jefferson's writings, he struggles with this, right? He needs his slaves because he's a terrible farmer, but he also recognizes that this is an evil. And so it's fair to hold him accountable. It's fair to hold him accountable to that. But that doesn't mean we should throw away these figures. We can condemn some of the things they did, but also recognize they did other things that were valuable. And then it's a matter of opinion. Do the goods outweigh the bads? I mean, that's where the expertise of the historian doesn't help. That's where we need more of the philosopher, right? Because that's then a question of moral judgment. It's our job to get it on the table. It's our job to tell the story and what was condemnable in its time, as Jackson's genocide of the Indians was. And then it's up to us as citizens and moral philosophers to then address, what is justified, what's not justified.
And then going back to one other achievement of Jackson's, and I'm thinking now of making inflation a policy. Today, engineered inflation is a very contentious issue. I mean, obviously nobody wants runaway inflation, but engineered inflation is something else. But with the benefit of hindsight, we can see the consequences of Jackson's policies in a way that we can't see the consequences of engineering inflation today. And I'm wondering if historians are in agreement about whether this was, in fact, an accomplishment of Jackson's.
I think most historians would agree it was an accomplishment because what he did was provide more liquidity, more capital in the economy that helped more people to become farmers, small business people, et cetera. There was an empowerment of the economy. It hurt investors, right? I mean, this is the issue, right? Inflation is always bad for people who have money because it makes their money less valuable. but those who are being paid money, it's an advantage to them. And this was an advantage to many of the people who voted for Andrew Jackson, who became the small shopkeepers, the business owners, et cetera, of the next generation.
And something before we move on that I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, as long as we're cataloging a few of the important American presidents, is just as Washington's mandate, his chief accomplishment was bringing the American people together. When Jackson entered the presidency, what was his priority, or what were his few priorities? And do we judge him as successful based on how things turned out?
So I would say that most historians, even those who condemn him, they would condemn him because he was successful. Here's what his goal was. It was very clear: to make the presidency serve the common man. He was the first president to say that it will not serve the elites, it will serve the common man. And he did that in an enduring ways, because he connected the presidency to ordinary people. Before Jackson's presidency, so many of the people who voted for him never cared, never voted. And now they're part of the system.
And some historians who would condemn Jackson for making the president serve the common man would do so because serving the common man, on their view, was immoral or unjust. Witness what
it was
happened
serving
to
the common white man, and implied in that was taking things away, particularly from Indians, and maintaining slavery. That serving the common man for him actually meant protecting slavery and stealing land from Indians.